Hey there, thanks for stopping by. The suggested reading for the following video is the stuff on screen right now. Pause real quick if you need to. If you're not caught up, then beware of spoilers. If you are, then enjoy the show. Okay, so the Natlan Archon quest has been wrapped up for a while now, and as of 5.5, our annual big regional world quest is also wrapped up too. Since both of those are out of the way, we finally have a more or less complete look at the story Natlan has been trying to tell so far. For better or worse, a lot of the substance in that story was given to us either in subtext or in material that's completely outside of the Archon quest. And because of that, there's been a lot of confusion regarding how and why certain things happened the way they did. There's a lot that deserves proper explanation, but this is already going to be kind of long as it is, and I'm not trying to trap you guys here for 3 or 4 hours, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to focus on how Natlan's themes are woven into the structure of how its history is told. And once that's out of the way, we're going to relate that to 2 narrative threads in the present day. 1, Capitano versus Mawiga, both philosophically and the on-screen fight, especially regarding Capitano's presentation. 2, Mawiga herself. We'll go over her apparent lack of internal conflict, her unimpeachable presentation, why she so perfect and all that stuff. These 2 things are very, very closely related, and understanding why certain storytelling decisions were made regarding one of these narrative threads will help a lot with understanding the other. A lot of the meat behind this stuff is locked behind world quests and character quests way more so than ever before, instead of all just being dumped into the Archon quest. So it's become way easier to just straight up miss a bunch of things. Don't worry if you haven't read a whole bunch of supplementary texts, because we're gonna make it all pretty simple right here, hopefully. Cool? Cool. Alright, grab a drink, pop a squat, here we go. Natlan's story and its major themes are framed around 2 opposing ideologies. These ideologies are championed by 3 pairs of important figures in the country's history. Once you acknowledge and understand these schools of thought, it's a lot easier to wrap your head around why certain things happen the way they do. So we'll lay them out here. On one side, you've got the optimists. They say mortals are awesome and can overcome anything, including the abyss, the way that they are. Mortality, even with all its ugly imperfections, is a strength, and people should never cede their autonomy to rulers or gods. They say that preserving history is the ultimate tool to overcome the finite nature of our mortality, and we should cherish that history no matter what. The other side vehemently disagrees. They say that if we have to sell out and do some crazy stuff just to preserve ourselves, even at the cost of our identity, then so be it. Even if that means evolving beyond what we would recognize as human or mortal. People who perpetuate this belief tend to believe more in centralized forms of authority like tyrants or helicopter parent gods who make all the decisions instead of trusting people to direct themselves. They'll say that progress and survival should take precedence over anything else, even if that means abandoning our own history. What could be should take precedence over what currently is. This isn't anything super novel or groundbreaking. This dichotomy has been all over Eastern media for a while now. Evangelion knocked it out the park once, and it's been copy-pasted in a bunch of anime and manga ever since. Even Hoyoverse took inspiration for it with Honkai 3rd. If you're not too familiar with the way this dichotomy works, or if the blurbs of text on screen are kind of confusing, it should make more sense as we start going through the examples. Okay, let's walk through history for a bit. Xbalanque is the guy who first introduces the former ideology to Natlan in general. Pretty much every major decision he makes reflects the humanity is the best thing that we mentioned before. The way Natlan's rules are set up are partly his idea. Unlike every other nation thus far, the mantle of Archonhood is passed down solely based on strength, without any interference from the judgment of higher powers. The elemental energy of the country isn't limited to just vision wielders and elemental beings. The sacred flame is a concentrated hotspot of elemental energy as well. That flame is largely fueled by competition between Natlanese fighters, hence the purpose of the pilgrimage, which, again, leaves it completely within human control. To drive the point home further, after Xbalanque defeated the Pyro sovereign, Renova comes down from heaven and gives him a vision of the future. A vision of Natlan being completely destroyed by the Abyss, which is an even worse future than the subservience to tyranny under the dragons that they had just avoided. And given how fate and predestination literally exist in Teyvat, an angel popping in from the sky to say, hey, you guys are kinda screwed is a serious deal. And he does not care at all in spite of all of this. He does not give up his ideology, not even close. He still bargains with Renova to be granted power to create Natlan's rules, and he still goes through with laying the foundation for future generations to hopefully succeed. In the face of being literally fated to fail, he still puts his full faith in people who haven't even been born yet. People he will never know or have rational reason to trust to see the task through. Again, in short, humanity is the best. The Sage of Stolen Flame Kukulkan is the guy who first introduces the latter ideology to Natlan. The Sage is he's a lot different. He's a veteran of the Celestia vs. Dragons War, so his perspective comes from a different place. He's lived through his people losing to Celestia 2 different times. His primary objective at this point is not to preserve his people in the same way that Xabalanque's primary objective is to preserve humanity. He wants his people to get back on top of the food chain at any cost, even if it means pushing anything they have to out of the way. So the Abyss has to go down, Celestia has to go down, no one gets to sit on the throne of Teyvat except for his guys. He's not a moron though. The dragons got their butts kicked twice when they relied on nothing but their own strength the first time and eventually abyssal power to fight Celestia the second time. And the Sage recognizes this. If they're gonna win this time, they need to acquire power and wisdom from other external sources. And the Sage, to his credit, recognizes that these weird little human things seem to be pretty tenacious. They have a knack for not dying. They'll build entire civilizations, get smacked down to almost nothing, and somehow rebuild, over and over and over again. That's the kind of tenacity that ensures longevity. That's the kind of tenacity that wins wars. So he spends a whole lot of time and effort trying to understand what it is that makes humans tick, why it is they're so freaking hard to beat down for good, to the point where he pulls off some nonsense that would make Dottore jealous and engineers his own son, Ochkan, into a dragon-human hybrid. I'm gonna say that again. He engineers his own son into a dragon-human hybrid. His own son? That's not the behavior of someone who feels dragons are the best, not in the slightest. Not in any way that's comparable to Xabalanque's version of it anyway. Xabalanque's decision-making was rooted in his faith in humanity's human characteristics. The Sage says the opposite. He says, to hell with whatever characteristics make dragonkind dragons. Being dragons already lost them 2 different wars. If evolution beyond dragonkind as it exists in the present is the price for victory, then so be it. Again, what could be should take precedence over what currently is. On top of that, his original plan was for Ochkan to kill the Pyro Sovereign and take his place, an act that, narratively, blatantly represents destroying and abandoning the very essence of dragonhood. This school of thought is what leads the Sage to ally himself with Xabalanque in his journey to becoming the Pyro Archon. He just has to know why humans are so badass. Anyway, that's the crash course for those two. They're the ones who lay the foundation for the 2 ideologies we're talking about. Now we get to jump forward. Years and years later, these 2 big shots are succeeded by the Scarlet-Eyed Youth, the second Pyro Archon, and the Tyrant of Natlan, Ochkan. Being a hybrid experiment of the Sage's making, Ochkan had been given a human body, and his father Kukulkan treated him more as a test subject than as his own son. His dad wanted to mold his test subject, his son, into the most powerful human he could possibly be, so he could eventually rule over the humans and tell his dad all about their secrets. And to the surprise of absolutely no one, Ochkan is not remotely okay with any of this at all. This was before Xabalanque took power, so people and dragons weren't exactly cool with each other. Dragons treated Ochkan like trash, so understandably he grows to hate dragons. I mean, really hate dragons. And when Xabalanque comes around to save him and start his journey, which ends with him beating up the Pyro Sovereign, Ochkan decides to follow him. Ochkan pretty much already worships this guy for saving his life, but when he actually beats the Pyro Sovereign, the apex of the people he absolutely hates, he treats Xabalanque like God with a capital G. Keep in mind, the guy's already an artificial half-breed who's gotta be very confused about the nature of his own existence. And his father basically threw him to the wolves with hardly any guidance. So when a proper leader-like figure basically drops in his lap, of course he latches on like crazy. When Xbalanque pays the price of death for using Renova's power, he leaves a massive power vacuum in his wake, and Ochkan immediately takes the reins. This is where the ideological schism starts regarding how power should be wielded. Xbalanque established the rules of Natlan based on his trust in the people. He has a system in place for choosing a successor from those people, a successor that would hopefully lead them as splendidly as he did. The people reciprocate this trust and decide to wait for that successor to arise. But Ochkan, as much as he worships his savior, comes from the sage's camp, biologically and philosophically. As the sage repeatedly shows us in Tolan, dragons covet power. Dragons follow the powerful. Dragons worship the powerful. Not even living among humans could completely erase the influence of Ochkan's true nature. The idea that anyone else should or could be worshipped as much as Xbalanque is nothing short of blasphemy to him, and so he enforces his point of view with an iron fist. Instead of honoring history the way it was, with Xbalanque's decree that humans and dragons should work towards coexisting, he was beholden to his own personal view of history, warped by his draconic nature, and ironically, his hatred of dragons, a view that saw Xbalanque as nothing more than a symbol of overthrowing their tyrannical oppression. In attempting to uphold and enforce that perspective on the country, he becomes a tyrant himself, obsessed with eliminating any threats to the humans that Xbalanque saved. At this point, the situation is reversed from when Xbalanque was around. It's a human civilization seeking to preserve humanity that's oppressing anything and everything else, instead of dragons doing so for their kind. Ochkan would go on to rob powerful dragons of their body, their memories, and their strength in order to power the grand city of Natlan. No sacrifice was too great if it meant elevating humanity. On the other side of the aisle, there's actually a lot less to say about the other guy. History often rhymes, especially in Teyvat, and tyrants tend to be followed by uprising. This time, instead of Xbalanque and his ragtag team of heroes, it's some weirdo with red eyes and his ragtag team of heroes. They end up winning, obviously. Ochkan is defeated, and the scarlet-eyed hero fulfills his destiny as the true second Pyro Archon. The cool part is what happens after, cause Red Eyes is a clever guy too. The reason they ended up in that situation in the first place is because Ochkan learned the wrong lesson from Xbalanque. If he hadn't revered his savior as a flawless deity worthy of eternal worship, he would have placed his trust in the people to produce a proper successor. And so, to make sure this never happens again, Red Eyes makes a rather unique request. Something that superficially seems very unlike a Natlanese hero. He asks for his name to be completely erased from history. However, he does this because he shares Xbalanque's outlook on humanity, and he trusts that future Pyro Archons should be chosen from the masses via the rules. He has to avoid a repeat of Natlan. He has to avoid a repeat of a tyrant ruler. He has to avoid anyone worshipping him the way Xbalanque was worshipped by Ochkan. The stories of the scarlet-eyed hero would still remain, despite this. Some believe that he was a reincarnation of Xbalanque, some believe that he was guided by a blessed Saurian. But even now, we don't blatantly get his name told to us anywhere in the game. And it worked out, didn't it? The Pyro Archon lineage functioned as the rules intended, being passed down over the years until the present day. Eventually, centuries later, these two guys show up. Now that we've got the context of how the two schools of thought were carried out by their predecessors, their actions require a lot less explaining. Mahuika got dealt a terrible hand. She became Archon when the country's morale was so far in the gutter that the sacred flame wasn't even being fed enough elemental energy to constantly keep the abyss at bay. Remember, just like we saw at the end of Inazuma, and like we see over and over in Natlan, positive emotions can translate directly into power in Teyvat. So, if your country's population is down in the dumps, then the sacred flame that relies on your country's morale is going to be down in the dumps too. To deal with this, she did as her predecessors did before her and immolated herself, offering the flames of her own soul as fuel for half a millennium. and trusting her successors to stay the course. And unlike Xbalanque, unlike the Scarlet-Eyed Youth, she had thousands of years of Natlan's history of humans being badass to substantiate her faith that they will indeed stay the course. Capitano, like his ideological predecessors, has a much different background from Mahuika and a much different point of view. Like the Sage of Stolen Flame, he witnessed his people succumb to their own weakness and fail. Like the hybrid Ochkan, his own humanity is slowly being deteriorated, both physically and mentally. So he swings to the other side of the bench from Mahuika and intends to amalgamate and sacrifice the memories and souls of the Night Kingdom, instead of preserving them. All for the sake of creating a super weapon made of their energy that would strengthen the ley lines and dispose of Kasoithoth. For anyone that paid extra attention to Ochka Natlan and the 5.5 update, yes, this is eerily similar to the endgame of the Sage's plan. That is no coincidence. As you can see, history often tends to rhyme. The reason that these two were at the forefront of the Ignition teaser, despite Capitano's limited screen time, isn't just because of their personal juxtaposition. It's because they are the current representatives for the two most important schools of thought in Natlan's history, fighting a tug of war for how to shape humanity's path forward. And given that this is the Nation of War, that tug of war predictably leads to a conflict between these representatives, which, well... Cool fight. I liked it. Really cool fight. Small problem though. Why did Capitano lose? Like, why did they have Capitano lose? Both these guys were insanely glazed as two of the strongest people around, right? I mean, seriously, like, for those of you who are a little newer to this, people were anticipating this fight as far back as 3.1 when Varka told us that Capitano was on his way to Natlan. This was a long time coming, so it doesn't make much sense to give the first Harbinger all that praise and build up all these expectations only to have him just take a fat L in his first on-screen appearance. It kind of just kills all the hype and just defeats the whole purpose of the whole thing. Like, it's just not a good idea, right? Right? Step into the writers' minds for a little bit. Natlan is aggressively, unapologetically a celebration of battle shonen anime. It opens up with a tournament arc, you meet the starry-eyed kid who's aiming to win, it climaxes with a war arc, you have the protagonist's rival who's their physical equal and ideological opposite, the Archon is literally a Super Saiyan, she beats the devil with a dragon fist, like it's super heavy-handed and in your face. It is not subtle at all. If you like that sort of thing, this next part will probably resonate a lot with you. The shonen heads can probably guess where this is going by now. If you're talking about storytelling, fights are extremely important to the battle shonen genre, and you can deduce a lot of the story's intentions from the way a fight is presented. Whether it's something like the nature of a character's abilities, how the decisions they make reflect their personality or their history, or how any given fight parallels a previous fight, just stuff like that. If the story is well written, important fights have a lot of storytelling meat behind them. When a shonen character loses an important fight, it's usually for at least one of three reasons. 1, they don't understand something about themselves. 2, they don't understand something about their circumstances. Or 3, they don't understand something about their opponent. Philosophically, I mean, not just like they don't know what the other dude's power does. Conversely, when a character is victorious in an important battle, it represents a level of sufficient comprehension or superior soundness of their ideology compared to their opponent. If you view it from this perspective, the fight in Act 2 makes a lot more sense. The portrayal of the captain as being incredibly powerful prior to his first proper appearance on screen was very much intentional, as was the outcome of the fight. As tends to be the case with many other character-related writing decisions in Natlan, the overall narrative surrounding what it means to be human took precedence over any single character's glory. In this case, it took precedence over the captain's glory. The immediate loss is meant to be unexpected. It's intentionally incongruent with the expectations built in for his character up until that point. The question being posed by the narrative by giving him this loss is, how the hell does someone that strong just lose? What is it that he doesn't understand? If you separate them from the ideologies that they embody, Mahuika and Thrain are absolutely swimming in parallels. You've got Mahuika's self-imposed 500 sleepless years of solitude in the Sacred Flame versus Thrain's 500 sleepless years of companionship from the cacophony of screaming souls in his heart. You've got Mahuika's fight with the Cataclysm, from which she gained undying faith in human willpower, versus Thrain's bout with the Cataclysm, from which he gained undying faith in the need to shed human limitations, if it meant survival. I mean, hell, his own body was artificially modified long before Renova even cursed him. Like, he was already thinking along those lines. It goes all the way down to more shallow, superficial things, the fire versus ice, both of them being sword wielders, both of them being revered as heroes. You get the idea. Point is, their personal stories are set up so that they are portrayed to be more or less equal in basically every way. And despite them being basically equal, Thrain still loses, which begs the question even harder: why did Thrain lose? The idea of not trusting humanity to see themselves through any crisis didn't start with Thrain. It didn't start with Ochkan, it didn't start with the Sage, it didn't even start in Natlan. It's been all over the game's story for the past 4 years. Once you ask the question of why did Thrain lose, what doesn't he understand, what mistake did he make, all you really need to do is look at the other characters who made similar mistakes. Look at people who aligned with his ideology and find the mistakes they made. Why did the tyrant Decarabian lose to Barbados? Why did the God Queen Raiden A lose to the Traveler? Why did the Sumeru sages fail to acquire divine knowledge in the end? Why did the Ordo fail in Fontaine? If you're talking about people who share the philosophical throughline of progress trumping history, lack of trust in the people, and all the stuff we went over before, they tend to make the same mistake in different flavors. Usually it's some variation of tyranny or an attempt at creating a collective consciousness, devoid of spirit and abandoning all individuality. But in principle, the root of the mistake is the same. It's the same ideological misstep that's caused Celestia's mishandling of humanity to be met with so much backlash from civilization after civilization. History is the incubator of culture. It's the vehicle by which ideas, hope, and wishes are able to transcend time and long outlive their masters. It's why the rest of the game won't shut the hell up about Mr. McSmeckledorf number 1337 who lived 9 million years ago in every single region. Everything about the story is pounding into your head that history and hope are necessary for a species to prosper. To throw those things away, like Capitano was ready to throw away Natlan's history and abandon hope in their people's ability to fight, is basically the same as surrendering to the very doom you might be trying to avoid. In terms of Natlan alone, Thrain's desperation to save the land led him down the path first led out by the sage before him. When you put it in the context of Tevat as a whole, his sin is in line with the antithesis of the entire story's message. So, for all his incredible might and reputation, to drive home the point that his ideology is that antithesis, Natlan uses one of the most important narrative tools in its arsenal, as a celebration of shonen: combat. That's a big part of why this fight was so hyped up by the story. Not only is it super cool, it's one of the most emphatic demonstrations of the message the entire game is trying to advocate for. History is a need. Hope is a need. So yes, he did indeed have to lose. But he doesn't lose for long. You may have noticed a little trend amongst the inheritors of the sage's ideology. With every generation, as time passes, they move a little closer to Xabalanque's side. The sage, although he allied himself with Xabalanque, was fully bought into this idea of the precedence of evolution over history, to the point where he's willing to strip his own son, and eventually dragons as a whole, of everything that defines them, in order for a more capable species to rise in their place, and take their place as the sole inheritors of the world. Ochkan, even though he fought for humans, seems like he starts off very similar to the sage. He had no intention of trusting any potentially wayward successors with power or with progress. He couldn't even bring himself to trust the alliance of the tribes at the time and preferred to consolidate as much political power within himself as possible. He was as distrustful of his human comrades as the sage was distrustful of the dragon's ability to find victory. However, years later, Ochkan would come to disagree with his father, his ideological predecessor, so much so that when confronted by the sage's profound disappointment in what became of Ochkan's life, Ochkan straight up tells him off. Quote, "Truly disappointing. I thought you would be the one to slay the Pyro dragon, ascending the throne of all Natlan and creating a new epoch for all dragonkind, and of course for all humanity." Ochkan replies, "Humans have no place in the world you envisioned." The sage replies, "A matter of interpretation, I say. Obsession with the individual is a human weakness, just like the fruit of your foolish hysteria, a sign of incomplete evolution. Your people, those humans, might not survive the cataclysm, but after the scouring, a civilization will blossom that surpasses both that of dragons and humans." And Ochkan replies, "Give up, foolish dragon. A world without humans is a world without meaning." So what happens by the time we get to Thrain? He has his little physical scuffle with Mahuika, the inheritor of Xabalanque's will, has a verbal scuffle with her later on, and then he's on board. Just like that, he switches sides. Because the sage was right about one thing. There really is just something about those darn humans. It's no surprise that a descendant of Khaenri'ah, the most humanity is the best civilization of them all, was written to be the current inheritor of the sage's will. Of course he would come around more quickly than his two predecessors. As terrified and desperate as the memory of the cataclysm had made him, there's no way in hell he was gonna resist that good old human badassery that reminded him so much of Khaenri'ah for long. And once he makes the switch, he is rewarded for it. He saves Mahuika. He saves Mahuika. He saves the life of the epitome of the very ideal he admits is superior. He saves all the souls who had nearly robbed him of his sanity for the past half a millennium. He gives the biggest middle finger to Celestia since Folklores, and she has to just watch him bend the rules of the world over his knee and rub it in her face. And he saves the Lord of the Night, the Night Kingdom, and Natlan itself. In the most profound display of abandoning the sage's ideology and jumping ship to Xabalanque's, he chooses to effectively become the Night Kingdom itself. He becomes the narrative manifestation of Natlan's history, the same history he was so ready to throw away for the sake of survival halfway through the Archon quest. Because history is a need, hope is a need, and humanity is worth it. They will always be worth it. Okay, anyway, that's all we've got to say about Thrain. Cool guy. Like that guy a lot. Very cool guy. Some say he's the best. He's the best guy. We all like that guy a lot. Not her, though. We do not like her. I don't know what they were thinking with her. I mean, Jesus Christ, she's good at everything. Everyone loves her. She never loses. Just no personality, no conflict, no emotion, just substance, just straight trash. I'm just kidding. Don't worry. Every Archon is associated with an ideal, and that ideal is often distilled into a single word. Justice, knowledge, contracts, or whatever. Don't be fooled, though. The words are just a shorthand. Each ideal that's represented by an element is pretty broad, and each ideal can take on many different forms. That's how you get the wildly varied interpretations of war by Pyro users, the different interpretations of freedom by animal users, so on and so forth. That's why Nahida, as the god of wisdom, was given a design that is the visual manifestation of childlike wonder. That's the piece of her ideal of wisdom that her physical form represents. As the ultimate incarnation of each of these ideals, the spiritual will that the Archon embodies has to encompass all the iterations of that ideal. So they end up being worshipped by different names depending on what aspect of their truth is being revered. So someone like Zhongli has been known as the Lord of Geo, God of Commerce, God of History, and several other titles because each of those titles represents a fragment of his ideal. For Mahuika, don't get thrown off by the word war. Each word, each ideal that an Archon encompasses is just kind of a moniker. It stands for a sort of constellation or a group of ideas that all fall under the umbrella of what it is that they stand for. Hence the many different interpretations thing. The constellation of ideas that the Pyro Archon embodies, war, passion, ambition, evolution, competition, the drive to improve, basically the things that Natlan rubs in your face every 2 seconds, must all be considered when discussing Mahwika's character, or any Pyro Archon, really. So what is it that this ideal of war pushes a Pyro Archon to do? One of the narrative threads that Genshin repeatedly harps on is the importance of preserving your story over your life. So preserve the positive traits that you embody, the example you provide for others to look up to, your social footprint, basically. That's what we mean when we say story. This is part of the history is super important thing. This is why characters who seek immortality and eternity at the cost of others' well-being are punished. Remus failed, Deshret failed, Baizhu gets told off for it in his story quest, Dottore. We'll get there eventually. On the other hand, it's why Zhongli is rewarded for his retirement with the peace of mind of knowing Liyue can look after itself. It's why Rukkhadevata is rewarded for leaving everything in Nahida's hands, with Irminsul and Sumeru being cured of forbidden knowledge. It's why Folklore's sacrifice is rewarded with Fontaine's salvation. They placed their personal story and the story of their people above their own life. Mahwika is a reiteration of this narrative thread in its most brazen form so far. She very literally put her life on hold 500 years ago, knowing that when she wakes up a half millennia later, that the people and Natlan of the past that she grew to love would be nothing but memories. She herself laments over the disconnect of being thrust back into the leadership role in an almost completely foreign nation towards the end of Act 2. She sacrificed the life she could have lived despite her family's mourning for the sake of ensuring that Natlan's story as a nation survives in the future. And it worked out reasonably well. The problem is, she goes too far. One of the perks of becoming Pyro Archon is being imbued with the memories carried by the ancient name Kyon-Gozi, which is carried by every preceding Pyro Archon. In addition, ascension to godhood in Teyvat in general seems to gift the ascendee with certain knowledge. Mahwika speaks on this briefly in Act 4. Quotes, "When a human ascends to the divine throne, their inner flame will awaken. The size of that flame depends on the person's potential." We see something similar towards the end of Sumeru with Scaramouche's temporary promotion. Quote, "When my spirit ascended to divinity, it felt as if I had existed for the same number of epochs as heaven and earth. Looking back, the existence of what once called itself Kunikazushi appears infinitely small and ugly." The combination of inheriting Kyon-Gozi and inheriting the divine throne is where Mahwika's knowledge of Descenders, dragon civilization, and other aspects of the past comes from. We see something similar when Mualani inherits Tupac's name and immediately gets memories of the past implanted within her. One caveat though, and this is extremely important: ancient names are not autobiographies. Ancient name forging is a finicky craft, because although a lot of care goes into acquiring accurate details of a person's life to ensure that the memories within the ancient name reflect reality, they're not a one-to-one recollection or replication of the person they represent, or people they represent. Similarly to how the story of Guthred that aided the Traveler in the final act was far more embellished and noble than the Guthred of reality, the recollections of each Pyro Archon contained within Kyon-Gozi come from the perspective of the people who observed them and told stories about them. People who, understandably, held their ruler, their god, with extremely high regard. Even the stories that we encounter in-game about previous Pyro Archons are almost entirely about how they were wonderfully dutiful to their people. This gets highlighted when Xbalanque is revived in Mahwika's story quest, and he's almost flabbergasted at how insanely revered he is, to the point where everyone seems to have forgotten that he was totally hilarious. And that seems to be the case for the story of Pyro Archons in general. For the most part, it's all just duty, and nothing but duty. So what happens when you take a whole bunch of memories of people who are portrayed almost entirely as tirelessly dutiful leaders and shove them into one person? There have been a whole bunch of Pyro Archons after all. It's no wonder that hardly anything is left of the inheritor of Kyon-Gozi in terms of outward appearance other than duty. It's no wonder that she mustered the strength to endure centuries of solitude, which brought her to the brink of total ego death. like actual ego death. She vocally expresses nearly forgetting her own sister, forgetting her mission, and forgetting who she herself even is. And then she thrusts herself back into a country at war on the brink of destruction right after being revived. It begs the question of how much of Mahuika is really left beneath the weight of thousands of years of Kiangozi's accumulated experiences. Even when Mahuika tires, when the flames of her ambition momentarily fatigue, could she really rest? Would Kiangozi ever let her rest? The game acknowledges this too. Similarly to how her facade of invincibility that she presents to her people only falters once in a blue moon to people who can notice the cracks, you kinda have to go a little out of your way to find the evidence of how her relationship with Kiangozi and being a Pyro Archon wears on her. Quote, "Thus did they all, old friends of Mahuika and relative strangers both, speak freely in the speaker's chamber, at times boasting of heroic achievements, and at others shedding silent tears for the passing of close kin and friends. Each item was well kept and maintained, and their numbers have only increased over the last 500 years up until now. However, only a few would finish the last of their drink after telling their story, pause for a moment, and then ask Mahuika if she had similar stories she wanted to share. And with a smile on her face, she would speak of her parents, of Hine, and of their two mischievous Yimkasaurs, the things she held most dear in the time she was about to lose. All of this stuff is pretty important, isn't it? No, all of it ceased to be important the moment we decided on this plan, even me." Mahuika always imagined her plan to fight against the Abyss as a lengthy journey, and herself as an adventurer carrying a full pack and marching toward her predetermined goal. Memory and love were the supplies she brought, and they would help see her through confusion and solitude. The existence of the path to victory was not something to be taken for granted. Rather, it was forged by countless heroes, past and present. Rather than a savior, then, Mahuika preferred to be known as an agent. But this alone was not enough. Her journey was no penance that required only willpower, but rather decisiveness and wisdom also. She could never have foreseen such marked variables as the Traveler or the Captain 500 years prior. But upon learning of them, she only needed a moment's consideration before deciding to incorporate them into the plan. In addition to any other considerations she might have had based on the realities of the situation, another factor played into her judgment, that both the Traveler and the Captain exhibited traits that mirrored her own. Were it not for their respective positions, she would have liked nothing more than for the three of them to sit and speak of their travels over grilled meat and drinks. After all, those who travel along the same road, never having a fixed residence, can best resonate with and understand one another. But she also had a deep understanding of the obstacles therein. Having traveled so far, it was only natural to not wish to show the fatigue or weakness in one's heart. And even she was no exception. She could easily tell stories about her comrades or family with a smile, but rarely could she speak of the sadness sown in the river of time by those happy moments. Nor could she take out her long-emptied haversack, point at it, and speak of how it reflected the current state of her heart. She could not, she would not, and she did not need to. So in the end, she kept a suitable distance, just as she always has. Everyone needed the ringing cheers and flowing wine of victory feasts, just as they needed the solitary quiet once the revelry faded. At first glance, she's not lonely at all. She's surrounded by people who respect and adore her, who would and do eventually die for her. But there's an invisible steel wall between their hearts and hers because of her position. She plays the part of down-to-earth personable god because, well, that's the kind of person she is. And she believes that's the best way to portray the perfect leader she feels her people need. But as far as interpersonal relationships are concerned, her humanity ends where her Archon position begins. The same way Ayaka felt disconnected from the people around her because of her need to uphold decorum as the Kamisato princess. The same way Farina felt disconnected from the people around her because she had to carry the weight of her country's fate on her shoulders for 500 years. Of course, it's not just the position of Pyro Archon that wears on her spirit. She's a wartime leader, so like everyone else in Natlan, the Abyss is a huge thorn in her side too. It has a unique effect on her, however, and she explains this towards the end of Act 5. Quote, "The pilgrimage was an essential part of our struggle against the Abyss, a grand competition full of promise and glory. But it also chained our people to an inescapable destiny. Fear and anxiety have been our constant companions. We knew what the consequences would be if we laid down our arms. Morality left us with no other choice. And so, Natlan became the nation of war. This is where Xbalanque defeated the dragons and granted our people the liberation of their flesh. And now, in the same place, I have the chance to grant them the liberation of their spirit. There will be no war, only competition, one fueled by our dreams for the future, rather than a desperate struggle for survival. Remember this? This is right before our good old captain swoops in and saves her from killing herself for the sake of duty. Again, remember, narratively, Archons completely embody the ideal they represent, not just a single aspect like a vision holder usually does. The reason that Moeka laments the way Natlan has been robbed of the joy of sheer competition and self-improvement just for the sake of self-improvement is because she's suffered the same loss herself on a personal level. Not only does the loss come from being forced to dedicate basically every aspect, almost every waking moment of your existence into staving off the abyss, but ironically, the very act of inheriting Kiongozzi partially robs its wielders of the meaning of Pyro's ideal. Moeka's got memories, experiences, and talents acquired from some of the most capable people in history, the previous Pyro Archons. That's part of why she's so insanely good at everything. She's naturally gifted, of course, but the Pyro Archon buff is kinda like the Captain America Super Soldier Serum. It just serves to greatly enhance what's already there. It's also a cheat code in a way. You know that whole joy of self-improvement thing? For any life experience that she would have otherwise had to trek through on her own, if Kiongozzi contains memories of a similar or identical experience from a past life, that path has already been laid out for her. The joy of self-improvement is snuffed out for that specific thing. So it kinda makes sense that she throws herself into esoteric puzzles and challenges at any opportunity. It's something that she enjoyed before she inherited her ancient name, and now it functions as a desperate attempt to cling to whatever is left of the self-improvement journey of life that Kiongozzi has already snatched away. This also doubles as kind of a smaller scale allegory for the harmful effects of the collective consciousness that Capitano's ideological peers in Teyvat have attempted to create. Death of the individual self means death of the joy of life's journey. It also doubles as further justification for why Xbalanque and the Scarlet-Eyed Hero absolutely did not want to be worshipped as perfect, flawless gods. Because the more perfect the memories within Kiongozzi are, the more damage they will do to future wielders, as they've done to Moeka. And besides, what good are memories if they don't let you learn from past mistakes? If the mistakes are blotched out and replaced with endless worship, what even is the point? Tossing herself wholeheartedly into her duty creates an interesting dynamic, considering she's the first human Archon so far. Time and time again, we've seen deities and supernatural beings attempting to become more human. Barbados living as a simple bard, Rex Lapis becoming Zhongli, or Folklores living out her humanity through Farina. In her efforts to fulfill her duty, Moeka goes in the opposite direction and attempts to emulate divinity. Never faltering, never tiring, leading as flawlessly as possible, and she suffers for it in the ways previously mentioned. It's to the point that she even physically burns artifacts, memories, a critical part of the human experience, once before entering the Sacred Flame 500 years ago, and then again to save the Traveler and company from the Night Kingdom. But in spite of all of that, in spite of her reaching for divinity to save humanity, Natlan's narrative, and the game's narrative in general, champions mortality above all else. So when she's half dead coming back from fighting the Abyss 500 years ago, it's her human friend who drags her body back to the stadium. When her mind is so worn after nearly 500 years of upholding the Sacred Flame that she almost completely loses herself, it's her human sister's memory that sets her straight. When she reclaims her seat as Archon and goes forth with the last stage of her plan, she has to place her faith in 6 humans with no guarantee that even a single one of them will awaken to their ancient name. When she's ready to sacrifice herself as penance for using Renova's power, it's Thrain, the human from Khaenri'ah who saves her skin. And again, we know Khaenri'ah is the #1 humanity is the best nation. The part that kind of sucks about all of this is there isn't really a big hard-hitting like aha moment that smacks you in the head with this narrative thread. I mean, like, look what we had to do for Moeka here. She's the literal Archon, the most important character in the country, and we had to comb through character stories to explain this stuff. That's insane, honestly. Compared to, say, Farina, who actually does smack you in the head with the sheer weight of her emotional distress towards the end of Fontaine, the fact that this stuff wasn't really highlighted for Mahuika in a similar way leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And rightfully so, honestly. Even something like having us actually play through her 500-year bike ride instead of confining that entire thing to an animated short might have helped. I personally like how it's done with Mahuika just because this is the kind of storytelling that resonates with me, like it's more my speed. But it's not what most people have come to expect from Genshin, because this isn't how Genshin usually rolls. For something this important, for something as big as the resolution of Mahuika coming to accept that she shouldn't abandon her humanity while chasing divinity, the lack of a big cathartic climax for that arc is less than she probably deserves, especially since all of the pieces had been laid out beforehand. It kind of exists, like that's half the point of Capitano's sacrifice and why Mahuika acknowledges her quote-unquote defeat at his hands. She recognizes that in that moment, he embodied her ideal even better than she herself had managed to. But that realization from her is super overshadowed by the whole thing with Capitano sticking it to Renova. So understandably, a lot of people missed the significance of how the whole scene affected Mahuika. All that to say, it's not all good, it's not all bad. I get that sensational opinions are popular and nuance is boring, but hey, take it or leave it. When all is said and done, and she has to lead her people forward in an era of peace, it's Xbalanque, the progenitor of the ideological path she set forth on, and the pinnacle of humanity in Natlan, who comes back for one day to set her straight. The only reason Kyon-Gozi had become such a powerful ancient name is because each prior Pyro Archon had led individual, unique lives in some way or another, and accumulated enough unique experiences that they weren't simply carbon copies of each other. That is the error in absolute duty over individuality. It breaks the formula and defeats the very purpose of the duty itself. That's the true meaning behind her acknowledging Thrain as the winner of the duel after his sacrifice. He found an avenue for her to live on, to get back in touch with her individuality, and fully explore the aspect of Pyro that had been snuffed out of her life by the fight with the Abyss. To lead the nation in reclaiming the aspect of Pyro that they had fallen out of touch with, even when she herself didn't see another way out other than her own sacrifice. When Xbalanque comes back, the reason he declares her the winner of their duel is because that's what he always wished for. He set the ancient name Kyon-Gozi in motion, set their ideological lineage in motion, so that they would grow in strength over time, until eventually they would be stronger than the Abyss. Just because humanity disagrees with the sage's ideology of discarding the present to save the future doesn't mean that we should swing totally in the other direction and discard the present to idolize the past. He understands, as Raiden Makoto also understood, that mortals are finite. Passing dreams, hopes, and ambitions onto future generations is our form of eternity, not physical immortality. Constant renewal of the flame of hope is the greatest gift we can give to those long past. So he looks to Mahuika with nothing but pride and gratitude. She who carried his flame to its ultimate goal, who manifested and completed the dream he began so many years ago. The one thing we see that finally breaks her impenetrable emotional barrier on screen is when he tells her that, yes, it's over now. You are more than just the Pyro Archon. You are more than just Kyon-Gozi. You are Mahuika, and you are human. Simply surviving was never the end goal. You can start living now. You should start living now. Natlan's sun has triumphed where the black sun of Khaenri'ah failed, and where the sun-beaten kingdom of Deshret failed, and defeated the sinful abyss with human ambition. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something, and once again, many thanks for stopping by.
Your parents, sister, comrades, and friends. Those who walked with you, and those who left you behind. Those who crossed blades with you, and those who prayed for your safe return. Each and every one. Mahuika, has one granted the special privilege to return, I can sense them calling for you, and watching over you from within the distant winds. Dear Mahuika, our esteemed Archon, leader of our people, how have you been doing? We all miss you so. There are so many things we want to say to you, but if we really were to say them, they'd just be those simple, heartfelt words. The war is over, Malika. All our efforts had meaning, and all our struggles bore fruit. This is the fairest and most precious thing in the entire world. May you be happy in this era of peace. May you eat well, sleep well, always be full of energy, and never forget that we will always love you.
Malika, my dear child, though we have ascended to Archonhood, never forget that we are still human. Live as you please, in this age of peace you forged with your own 2 hands.
Why so formal all of a sudden? Seriously,